In this video we are going to talk about Darth Vader's suit and how he felt when he was wearing it. The informations are taken from the novelization called Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, written by James Luceno. The book is from the Legends timeline and takes place a few weeks after the events of Revenge of the Sith. Let's begin. To the galaxy at large, Jedi Knight Anakin Skywalker, poster boy for the war effort, the hero with no fear, the chosen one, had died on Coruscant during the siege of the Jedi Temple. And to some extent that was true. Anakin is dead, Vader told himself. And yet, if not for events on Mustafar, Anakin would sit now on the Coruscant throne, his wife by his side, their child in her arms. Instead, Palpatine's plan could not have been more flawlessly executed. He had won it all: the war, the Republic, the fealty of the one Jedi Knight, in whom the entire Jedi Order had placed its hope. The revenge of the self-exiled Sith had been complete, and Darth Vader was merely a minion, an errand boy, allegedly an apprentice, the public face of the dark side of the Force. While he retained his knowledge of the Jedi arts, he felt uncertain about his place in the Force, and while he had taken his first steps toward awakening the power of the dark side, he felt uncertain about his ability to sustain that power. How far he might have been now, had fate not intervened to strip him of almost everything he possessed, as a means of remaking him, or of humbling him, as Darth Maul and Tyrannus had been humbled before him, as indeed the Jedi Order itself had been humbled. Where Darth Sidious had gained everything, Vader had lost everything, including for the moment at least the self-confidence and unbridled skill he had demonstrated as Anakin Skywalker. Vader turned and moved for the hatch. But this is not walking, he thought. Long accustomed to building and rebuilding droids, supercharging the engines of land speeders and starfighters, upgrading the mechanisms that controlled the first of his artificial limbs, he was dismayed by the incompetence of the medical droids responsible for his resurrection in Sidious's lofty laboratory on Coruscant. His alloy lower legs were bulked by strips of armor similar to those that filled and gave form to the long glove Anakin had worn over his right arm prosthesis. What remained of his real limbs ended in bulbs of grafted flesh, inserted into machines that triggered movement through the use of modules that interfaced with his damaged nerve endings. But instead of using Durasteel, the medical droids had substituted an inferior alloy, and had failed to inspect the strips that protected the electromotive lines. As a result, the inner lining of the pressurized bodysuit was continually snagging on places where the strips were anchored to knee and ankle joints. The tall boots were a poor fit for his artificial feet, whose claw-like toes lacked the electrostatic sensitivity of his equally false fingertips. Raised in the heel, the cumbersome footgear canted him slightly forward, forcing him to move with exaggerated caution lest he stumble or topple over. Worse, they were so heavy that he often fell rooted to the ground, or as if he were moving in high gravity. What good was motion of this sort, if he was going to have to call on the Force even to walk from place to place? He may as well have resigned himself to using a repulsor chair and abandoned any hope of movement. The defects in his prosthetic arms mirrored those of his legs. Only the right one felt natural to him, though it, too, was artificial, and the pneumatic mechanisms that supplied articulation and support were sometimes slow to respond. The weighty cloak and pectoral plating so restricted his movement that he could scarcely lift his arms over his head, and he had already been forced to adapt his lightsaber technique to compensate. He could probably adjust the servo drivers and pistons in his forearms to provide his hands with strength enough to crush the hilt of his new lightsaber. With the power of his arms alone, he had the ability to lift an adult being off the ground. But the Force had always given him the ability to do that, especially in moments of rage, as he had demonstrated on Tatooine and elsewhere. What's more, the sleeves of the bodysuit didn't hug the prostheses as they should, and the elbow-length gloves sagged and bunched at his wrists. Gazing at the gloves now, he thought, this is not seeing. The pressurized mask was goggle-eyed, fish-mouthed, short-snouted, and needlessly angular over the cheekbones. Coupled with a flaring dome of helmet, the mask gave him the forbidding appearance of an ancient Sith war droid. The dark hemispheres that covered his eyes altered out light that might have caused further injury to his damaged corneas and retinas, but in enhanced mode the half-globes reddened the light and prevented him from being able to see the toes of his boots without inclining his head almost 90 degrees. Listening to the servomotors that drove his limbs, he thought, this is not hearing. The med droids rebuilt the cartilage of his outer ears, but his eardrums, having melted in Mustafar's heat, had been beyond repair. Sound waves now had to be transmitted directly to implants in his inner ear, and sounds registered as if issuing from underwater. Worse, the implanted sensors lacked sufficient discrimination, so that too many ambient sounds were picked up, and their distance and direction were difficult to determine. Sometimes the sensors needled him with feedback, or attached echo or vibrato effects to even the faintest noise, allowing his lungs to fill with air. He thought, this is not breathing. Here the med droids had truly failed him. From a control box he wore strapped to his chest, a thick cable entered his torso, linked to a breathing apparatus and heartbeat regulator. The ventilator was implanted in his hideously scarred chest, along with tubes that ran directly into his damaged lungs, and others that entered his throat, so that should the chest plate or belt control panels develop a glitch, he could breathe unassisted for a limited time. But the monitoring panel beeped frequently and for no reason, and the constellation of lights served only as steady reminders of his vulnerability. The incessant rasp of his breathing interfered with his ability to rest, let alone sleep. And sleep, in the rare moments it came to him, was a nightmarish jumble of twisted, recurrent memories that unfolded to excruciating sounds. The med droids had at least inserted the redundant breathing tubes low enough so that with the aid of an enunciator, his scorched vocal cords could still form sounds and words. But absent the enunciator, which imparted a synthetic bass tone, his own voice was little more than a whisper. He could take food through his mouth as well, but only when he was inside a hyperbaric chamber, since he had to remove the triangular respiratory vent that was the mask's prominent feature. So it was easier to receive nourishment through liquids, intravenous and otherwise, and to rely on catheters, collection pouches, and recyclers to deal with liquid and solid waste. But all those devices made it even more difficult for him to move with ease, much less with any grace. The pectoral armor that protected the artificial lung weighed him down, as did the electrode-studded collar that supported the outsize helmet, necessary to safeguard the cybernetic devices that replaced the uppermost of his vertebrae, the delicate systems of the mask, and the ragged scars in his hairless head, which owed as much to what he had endured on Mustafar as to attempts at emergency trephination during the trip back to Coruscant aboard Sidious's shuttle. The synth skin that substituted for what was seared from his bones itched incessantly, and his body needed to be periodically cleaned and scrubbed of necrotic flesh. Already he had experienced moments of claustrophobia, moments of desperation to be rid of the suit, to emerge from the shell. He needed to build a chamber in which he could feel human again. If possible. All in all, he thought, this is not living. This was solitary confinement. Prison of the worst sort. Continual torture. He was nothing more than wreckage. Power without clear purpose. That's the video for today, guys. I hope you liked it. If you are new to the channel, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, may the Force be with you.